Yeah. So what do you think it means to be a good man? What? So yeah, maybe kick us off like name and where you're from and what you're working on and why you're interested in just discussing more about masculinity. Why is it
Uh,
important to you?
My name is Orlando Teller. I'm a writer and a poet. I'm originally from the Midwest, from St. Louis, Missouri. I currently live in California, kind of like Central Valley area in Merced, California. And I wrote a book called My Scars Are My Birthmark, which kind of delve into a number of things, poems I've been writing over the past 20 years because it came out into 2021. And in those, some of those poems, I delve into just issues of my own, being a man, being gay, and issues of masculinity, and just growing up in community. Sometimes where you didn't feel as if you were equal because you didn't have the same definition of masculinity that others around you, or what was maybe taught to you. And so I delve into those some of those things in my book. My scars are my birthmark, which is on Amazon.com.
Cool. And I'm curious. So what was the relationship between writing and masculinity? How did you use poetry and writing as like a vehicle to explore that?
Because one thing about poetry that I like is a very creative and can be a very fluid type of format to write with, because you have, of course, you have some types of formats of poem that you have structure, but then I would say in modern times, probably the last 30, 40 years, a lot more poets are using a much more free form type of poetry in order to write and express themselves. And I felt like because some of the influences on me as a writer come from the Harlem Renaissance, and the Harlem Renaissance is filled with individuals, both male and female, who honestly, when you look at who break the typical stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, because the Harlem Renaissance has a number of people connected to in the Harlem Renaissance who were not heterosexual, both male and female. And so I begin to see strength not only in myself, but strength in just being who you are in those writings, because those writers were very bold and very prolific in what they're writing, despite the era in which they come from and the topics that they were trying to tackle in an era where a great deal of erasure existed with respect to being black and the intersection of sexuality. Yeah.
Interesting. And I would love, maybe not now, but at the end, I would love to just get just kind of like the 30 seconds, minute, like elevator pitch for your book, because I'd love to post that as like a resource for our platform and on the website. So I'll make a mental note just to save time for that at the end. I want to make sure we get to our core questions that I like to ask everyone, which is what does masculinity mean to you, and from where do you think you learned it from?
Okay, it's a lot. I mean,
That's how we
there's
ask everyone.
a lot of talk being talked about masculinity, and for good reasons, I think. But I think for me, one of the first things when I really start examining, I learned that I feel like masculinity most times is talked about in being just simply opposite to femininity, which a lot of times ends up being opposite to women. And strictly just looking at, well, this is how women are. That's how I thought. A lot of times I feel like we talk about how women act, and then we're to do the opposite. And I'm not sure that has always been a great definition of a way to operate, because I think that has led into some of the problems now, I think, with some men and their struggles with changes in tradition. But I think for me, I feel like masculinity has really, the definition is really centered around one, a person being a builder, and one who's being a protector. And I saw those things in my neighborhood growing up, because I'm a child. I was born in the late 60s and grew up in the 70s and 80s. And what was great for me in that era is that I saw kind of like this kind of like intersection of, at that time before things changed, where I grew up in a neighborhood where men, because of the times, they used to refer to each other as baby. They'd be like, "Hey, what's up, baby? What's going on? Anything happened in the hood? You need some help with you getting your fixed break? All right, baby, see you later. I'm gonna help you fix those later after breakfast with the family." So it was very, so as times changed, particularly, I would say, with the Ronald Reagan era. And then in the Ronald Reagan era, there was a lot of things happening, not only the drug era, you also had the proliferation of the gang era, you had the proliferation, unfortunately, of prison culture, and this fascination, not only just in the Black community, but also I feel like in the country as a whole about this kind of, I don't, to me, I felt like it was a very brutal form of masculinity that we were propping up, and not only just the cowboy image, but also the gangbanger image, and that gang mentality is, I think, proliferates America, and not only just from the Black community images, but white community as well. You look at the Italians, look at the Irish. When you look at a lot of films and a lot of television, some of the most prolific films or discussions about comes from the most violent portions of the Irish community, the most violent portions of the Italian community, and that gets held up to me as this is the top echelon of masculinity, and so. And what I think people forget sometimes in my own thought process, I don't know a man who's truly a builder who doesn't nurture what he builds. And I think that's one of the pieces that I feel a lot of men forget, that we talk about, I'm here to protect the children, to provide, and protect her, yeah. But you have to also, like, when you build something, say for instance, if you make woodwork and you build this table and you're just trying to get it to the shape and the color design, you're really nurturing that thing. It's like you're forming it to be born. And that, and many guys I knew back who were like, people worked in woodwork, people who worked in metalwork, who were welders, they looked at those things as their creations and they nurtured them to a certain way, right? So, and I think that's, for me, in modern times, that's the piece I see a lot of men missing, is that to build something, you have to actually you're not only adding the structure and all that kind of stuff to it, but you actually have to add some emotion to it, bring it alive. And I think, for me, I feel like that is the piece of masculinity that is missing, that we constantly focus on masculinity being that you're a man and you show up with your super cape on, hey, you're back. And you're laughing because you know what I'm talking about. It's that kind of stuff. And that unfortunately has permeated the psyche of so many of us. And now the thing also, if I can, like from the Black community side, Black women have never really had the privilege of being kind of like the classical image of a mom who stays at home, takes care of the kid while the dad goes out. And two reasons for that is, one, we have not been able to be a large part of the middle class now to actually have the economy and the legacy wealth to live that type of lifestyle. But I think also Black women, because of the history of Africans who were enslaved in this country, they came in working side by side with their men. So when you think of it from a psychological standpoint, it doesn't matter what culture. It could be an Asian female. She's working alongside her Asian man in the fields and this doing it. It's hard for you to vision this woman. This woman now has to take a back seat to you, who you are, and now basically do a pedestal, sit on a pedestal kind of thing, and be talked down to. It's hard for, I would say, any woman in any culture to take that as now her new role, so to speak, or her new image of herself, when she had an image that was pretty much historically already on par with the male image. And I think those are the things I learned. And I learned also from my mother that, because I grew up in a single parent home, and she basically taught us that there are no roles in this house. I'm the mom, things I'm doing as that, because I'm a mother, I'm the parent. But cleaning the house, cleaning your clothes, cooking, doing yard work, because she did it herself. As we got older, she started relinquishing those, as responsibilities to the children in the family. So there was no, like, I learned, like, even now, even with my sisters and nieces, they always say the men in the family are the better cooks, despite the fact that the women were the primary cooks. You understand what I'm saying? So it's unfortunately become a more complex conversation than it needs to be. And I think one of the things I just feel like men just need to recognize that they have to be, just like women have been asking, I would say for the past 20 years, for men to recognize them as a full sexual being, that they have needs outside of you getting yours. Men have to recognize and also demand from women that I'm a full emotional being. And you have to let me be emotional. You have to let me love. You have to let me be in pain. You have to let me be frustrated. You have to let me be sad with you. You have to let me, you don't like to talk about it, you have to let me cry sometimes. And you should be okay. And you have to be okay letting me cry because that helps me be okay crying in the appropriate moment. And so if I have children, my son will see, oh, there's times when, yeah, the pain is so hard. My dad didn't do anything but cry, but he still figured it out. He got up and kept going. The girls will see that didn't make him less of a man and he's not stronger. And then afterward, it seemed like he was stronger after he cried and got it all out. And that's what I think, that's for me. That's why I think that the biggest thing is that men need to recognize that being a builder also means you are a nurturer. And I think that's a piece we've forgotten.
Mm, so many things, so
Yeah.
many things. I mean, I love the language you brought in describing them. I think the idea of masculinity as defined as the juxtaposition against femininity is a really interesting concept that I think can explain a lot of the phenomenons we see in unhealthier forms of
Yeah.
masculinity. And then you providing a separate analogy for like masculinity that stands on its own, independent from the juxtaposition of femininity as the builder and nurturer, makes a ton of sense. And those elements of building and nurturing require that you have some emotional investment in those activities. And
There's a writer I'd like to share with you. His name is Maladome Some. He is a writer out of West Africa, and he is Maladone Some. He's a writer. He has a book called, I think it's Water and Spirit. Water and Spirit, I believe is the name he's called. And I read that book. I have it around here somewhere. But in that book, one of the things that also helped me on my journey in understanding, masculinity and putting, an appropriate perspective. In many West African societies, the uncle on the mother's side is looked at as thought of as the male mother. And it was a concept that was like, that really kind of, even when I was reading, it was like, huh? But then when I started reading what he was talking, it makes perfect sense that the male who is the brother to the mom acts like a male mother. In other words, he is there to supply emotional support for her children that the father may lack. And you can't, and the concept is so funny because you're male and you're mom. It's male and mother. So you're obvious about mother, but when you grow up with this concept, you learn if I have nephews and nieces, I need to be there to help add my additional nurture to them so they are not walking around with no men in my family are emotionally available. And so that really stuck with me. And I think the more we get to these things that your masculinity doesn't have to exist exclusively without femininity being attached to it. And I feel like more men who have the appropriate amount of femininity intersecting with their masculine definition, they seem to be much more healthy mentally. That's been my experience. I don't know about you, but that's been my experience.
well, and it connects to, you were describing the most celebrated forms of masculinity socially have been derived from the most violent upbringings where these men have survived and thrived all on their own and in the most violent and turbulent circumstances. And that's what's celebrated, is like above all turmoil rises one man who's survived against all. Yeah, but it's just, that's not how we're humans. We operate on a community level, and like you said, validating men as more complete vessels for emotions, and having that like validated by women is also really important. Like allowing space for men to feel emotions is just as important as men like taking it on themselves to be that more complex human.
And just men being just like open to like love, it's one of the times like I've like been in certain situations like just either watching television or like out and about, and when I see men who are well adjusted emotionally and grab their child, their son or daughter, and they pull them real close and kiss them on top of their head or give them a playful thing, and everybody, and he looks as gleeful as the children to get their love from him. He looks as gleeful to give it as they are to get it from. You know what I mean? And it's such a beautiful and heartwarming. I mean, honestly, I've been in those moments. I feel like I've had tears roll in my eyes because unfortunately I didn't get a lot of that myself growing up. And so it's a beautiful thing to see that the other men who are well adjusted with their emotions are not afraid to publicly have displays of affection, toward their children or other children that they care of. So it really is a beautiful thing. And I think the more we can do that, there's power in that. There's power in, as much as men like to talk about power and all that there's power in you still being able to exist in your definition while at the same time add more to it. In other words, that you have this level of masculinity while at the same time that masculinity doesn't simply break apart completely because you show love or emotion to people. That's powerful too. That's powerful. It's kind of like when watching wrestling, there was, I think it was either Stone Cold Steve Austin, one of the other kind of like badass, I'm sorry, in the platform or bad type of wrestlers. He said it's nothing like, he said people, get these concepts about who wrestlers are. He said, but there's nothing gayer than two half-naked men rolling around playing grab behind in the ring. And I was like, when I heard him say that, it made so much sense to me because he was like, I have fun with this thing. Yeah, I might be this, hardcore redneck type character, but I'm in the ring. He said, this is just joy for me. I'm like 8 years old, jumping around in the ring and wrestling.
Playing around, yeah.
And I think that's where that's another piece when you're talking about what helped you earlier. I would say for me, remembering like when I was 8, 9 years old, those things, those activities, and what about those activities that made me happy. So for me, like, even though, okay, yeah, we're riding the bikes, but I would be just about as excited with my microscope, sitting down with my little bitty tiny Petri disc and all that kind of stuff and sliding under, seeing what these different cells meant and those kind of, and it was wondrous to me because it was all new, it was all fresh. It was like just, and my mom was like feeding that interest. Like, there were no books. Like when I was a kid, I was talking to my brother about this just the other day. I was such an avid reader. Like one time I was at the libraries and they moved the library, but it's an old library, probably no bigger than a bungalow. But it was the only library I had in my community. And I would go there. And one time, there's this book I was reading. It was a reference book, and I couldn't check it out. And it was getting dark, and it was ready to lock up the library. And so I was trying to hide in the library so I could get locked in the library and finish reading that book because it was so exciting to me. But it was a reference book. So my mom ended up. She was like, you know what? I'm assigned for him. I was a juvenile. I had a juvenile reading card. Shout out to all the librarians out there who are great and were like warriors to me and this issues out here. And they the librarian called my mom, okay, why don't you sign for him to have an adult library card? And she said, yes, because it doesn't matter what happened. If I don't sign for him, he's going to read them anyway. So that's kind of thing I think I would say, get back to, even if it takes a moment. What was those things, those activities you did? Do those things just one day. One day, sit down, use Legos. If it was playing with Lincoln Logs, if it was playing with a Tyco racing set that had that worked and it had actually headlights on the cars that worked. If that excited you, sit down and then let that moment kind of like permeate you and start understanding what it really means to be alive. And I think that's sometimes what we miss, that joy from childhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of good inner child work out there, and it's so important for guys. I think losing playfulness is
Yes.
it's categorized as a part of growing up, but it's so tragic. It's like borderline tragic, right? To lose that element, it's so important for us.
I mean, even in your own relationships, as you grew up, like when we were like, we often talk about like when we were between like 5 and 8, again, ages 5 and 8, the levels of physical intimacy were powerful. And I noticed that other societies outside of the United States, men still maintain their
Mm-hmm.
intimacy. So
Mm-hmm.
often kind of surprised when we see men in India walking around holding hands, because in our eyes, that means that's a homosexual relationship, because that's what we were taught.
Mm-hmm.
Because you could no longer walk around with your arm around your friend's neck or around his waist or hold his arm or let him put his head on your shoulder. He was crying. No, it's like, get off my shoulder. You're crying. You be a man. Grow up. It's time. It's time. It's time. It's time for what? And we're all messed up now, but it's time though.
Yeah, no, it's something I've heard in a theme in these conversations is that it's uh too much of the human need for touch is reserved only for romantic relationships, and it puts too much importance on that relationship, too much pressure on it, and just also not enough of it. Because if your whole community is there to support you on like a physical level, that's amazing, and it's not there.
And I think that's why I was watching one of your other episodes, and on one of the episodes, somebody talked about isolation amongst men. And I think that's why so many men, by the time they're 40 years old, they feel so isolated because
Mm.
the intimacy that you needed to keep those relationships, you were forced by society to throw all that away. So when we hang out, it's so superficial. It's sports, it's drinking, it's like, oh, or sexual conquest, or just kind of politics of the day, but nothing real like nothing real personal that kind of talks about how you feel, how your day is going, how the work environment and work is affecting you, how the COVID pandemic truly affected your mentality. You're at you're 40 years old and you have three kids. What is that relationship like? Your kids are 20 and you're 45. How is that? What is that relationship like? Or your kids, you know what I'm saying? We don't really have those conversations once we get to a certain, and that's because we are taught to and trained from heteronormative ideas that once you get a certain age, you stop those kinds of things. Whereas I know men from West Africa, Mali, Nigeria, even from the West side, East side, like Tanzania, and they have beautiful, strong, emotional relationship with the men because their society, they have other issues, but not that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think it's so important to look at other cultures and societies that don't penalize men for um, for showing that kind of affection, right? And so
Mhm.
there's a lot to learn there. I'm curious. I want to sneak in one more question where I want to ask how you have developed your perception, because you mentioned like the well-adjusted man who's like comfortable emotionally, and I'm curious what your journey was, in one, just like recognizing that as like a goal, or if you feel like you have reached there, like what was your process in developing like, okay, I'm going to be a healthy man.
Honestly, I think what it was for me is two things. I think just the intersection of being male and being also gay, and the events of just as you're growing older, and like you said, the issues of isolation and the issues of not, I guess, feeling not fully accepted as a person within your own community and in the larger society. And I had to sit down and really think about what is it that they say I lack, and let me sit down and determine for myself, is that truly something I lack, or is that something that is in them? And I've learned that it is something that is in people that you've been trained to think that way. Another part of it for me and is also getting rid of religion for myself. As you, from my perspective, I put it this way: religions are very toxic towards people who don't fit a certain mold. It doesn't matter whether you're women or men. If you don't fit a certain mold in a particular religion, then you are looked at as being apostate. Again, you're now looked at as being something that is an other and something that is different. And much of what I found the reasons why is just simply there was a certain narrative that religions and societies felt they needed to propagate in order to further society. In order to build society, we need certain people have to think a certain way. I think some of that is what I felt was in there. And some of that stuff, as you know, is built into religion. And so when I threw away religion and accepted more spiritual ideas about how people are to come together, like even the concept of democratic issues or social democratic program, those programs are old ideas that permeate many societies, predating Islam, Christianity, Shintoism, and any other religion. And many of those societies felt in order to have a real society that works for everyone, we don't let people fall through the cracks. We take care of everybody. Everybody might not be rich, but nobody's going to be out in the streets begging and destitute. That's not how, what I'm saying? That's not how society operates from their perspective. These old, but now nobody really cares. It's okay if you fall through the cracks because there's certain ideas about why you're there and how you got there. And I think for me, when I threw away religion from that perspective, I was no longer using that as my soundboard about what's happening in life. That means I have to actually sit down and really see what are the actual factual things happening in life. And I think a lot of people don't do that. And I think that leads to why you have things like fake news now, because people don't actually truly engage with the facts as much as they're supposed to. You know, okay, you look at the facts are, say, for instance, that 70% of Black men who are fathers are engaged in their lives. But the actual factual that was being told to us before that, for the past probably 20, 30 years, that Black fathers are not good fathers, are not there. And it's just not a fact. And so that's what being when I began to like go through this process of letting go things that I felt were oppressive to me. I think that's what it is, letting go things that are oppressive to me. And religion was one of those things. I was able to see myself more clearly and understand that from that perspective, the things that we expect God to do are really the things that men are supposed to do. When I say men, I mean mankind. That we look for God to say, God is going to reach out and take care of the world. Well, if we're these builders, then we're supposed to be in warriors. That's exactly what we're supposed to be doing, building and taking care of the world around it and listening to people, as well as listening to, from my perspective, what I've learned is listening to kind of the spiritual energies around us about what to do and what not to do and how to interact with people and to help people get to where they need to be and not simply where you want. It's a shared plan. And then from a sexual perspective, I started looking at, okay, we have what, almost 8 billion people on this planet. What do you need from me? You don't need me to give you another human being. That's fine. I'm okay. And you.
Yeah, I think, and especially, I love the way you phrase the concept where you took a look at yourself and the systems around you, and you had a decision point where, okay, I see differences here, and I'm going to determine whether that's a problem with them or me, and making the decision that I'm going to be myself authentically despite the frictions with the system around me, and that's their shortcoming, is such a healthy way of doing that, because so many men and so many of the issues in society today, I think, can be pinpointed to rejecting your authenticity and seeing the shortcomings as yourself for not fitting in with the system. And that's such a powerful concept to share with the followers. I want to save a little bit of time at the end just to hear more about your book, because I would love to share that, and then I have to hop for another interview.
Okay, no problem. So yeah, so the first book I have came out. It's a book, like I said before, it's called "My Scars Are My Birthmark," and basically in that book, I'm looking at, as we go through. The title comes from, I feel like as we go through life, the damages that we experience, both physical and traumatic, from just growing and living, become like almost a birthmark once you arrive. Once you get to that point in your life where you feel like you're stable emotionally and spiritually, and it's almost like you had to get those birthmarks in order to really feel like you're fully born and realized in this life and in this world. And so in that book, there are a number of different poems that I go through, just looking at not only myself, my journey as a person, but also my comments about things that happen in the Black community, the things that happen in the greater United States of America and just humanity as a whole. And then I end that particular book with a few short stories that look at where we are as a society. I'm a big fan of a writer by the name of Octavia Butler. If you've ever heard of her, and she has a book series called the Xenogenesis series. And in the Xenogenesis series, she looks at what would happen if the planet was actually taken over by aliens, and what would that look like? That now humans are now basically having to work for a whole alien race on their own planet, and what does that look like? And so I give up. There's a short story in mind that kind of pay homage to her, called The Book of 144,000, where it looks at the parents the idea that the people who may get to be heaven might not necessarily be who you think. So it's best to work on yourself. But you have no control of who's going to get.
I love that. Really, really awesome to meet you, and it's such awesome insights. That really grateful for your time and for sharing with us.
You can find my book on Amazon, so you can do like a screenshot of the cover.
Perfect.
And all the good stuff in my bio.
Perfect. And I would love to be in touch. I'm sure there's a bajillion things we can we can
Yeah,
have more
man. I got another book
conversations
that's
on.
coming hopefully in June of this year. It's called Black Music, Politics, and Word Bombs. And that's coming out hopefully by Juneteenth. Where it's a
Awesome.
little bit more politically explosive and kind of looking at some of the things that I kind of was thinking about as we were coming at the end of Trump's era and coming out of the pandemic. So I think it's going to be a really
Cool.
powerful explosive.
Cool. Yeah, I would love to keep pace with your work and keep in touch.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Really,
Yes,
really
please do.
appreciate having you in the community and for sharing all your thoughts.
Thank you. And reach out to me if you need anything from me before you post.
For sure.
All
All
right,
right.
you take care.
I'm on to the next. So good to meet you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your work.
Of course, of course. It's a privilege.
Bye.
All right. Have a good day.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye. Yeah. So what do you think it means to be a good man?
I don't think there's a single definition.
Things that make up a good man are just things that make up a good person. Someone who's honest, someone who's decent.
You're also willing to express yourself in a healthy way, and you're in touch with your emotions as well.